Have you ever opened the door for a stranger and felt something was just wrong? You couldn't explain it, couldn't pinpoint why, but your gut told you that something was off. Most people shrug off that feeling, but sometimes it's the only thing that saves you. I had been living in this quiet little Oregon town for about a year. It wasn't the kind of place where things happened. No crime, no excitement, just quiet suburban streets with houses spaced far apart. It was the kind of neighborhood where people left their doors unlocked and waved to each other from across their driveways. That's what I liked about it. It felt safe. That night, I had just gotten home from a long day of work. I was a teacher, which meant by Friday night, I was drained. Too tired to cook, I ordered a pizza and plopped onto the couch, flipping through channels while waiting for it to arrive. The app said it would take 30 minutes. When the doorbell rang just 15 minutes later, my first thought was, wow, that was fast. I got up, stretched, and walked to the door. Through the peephole, I saw a young guy, maybe late 20s, wearing the pizza place's uniform. Hat, polo shirt, and jeans. He looked completely normal. I opened the door, smiling. "Hey, that was quick," I said, reaching for my wallet. He hesitated, just for a second, but long enough for me to notice. His eyes darted past me, like he was looking inside my house. That's when I felt it. Something was off. "Yeah," he muttered. "Not too busy tonight." I nodded, waiting for him to hand me the pizza, but he didn't. He just stood there, shifting on his feet. Then he asked, "You live here alone?" The question caught me off guard. It wasn't exactly creepy, but something about the way he said it made my skin prickle. I forced a small laugh. Yeah, just me." The moment I said it, I regretted it. His expression changed, just slightly. A flicker of something in his eyes before he looked over his shoulder down the street. Then he nodded quickly, shoved the pizza into my hands, and turned to leave. "Have a good night," he said over his shoulder, almost too fast. I shut the door and locked it, my heart still hammering. I stood there for a moment, gripping the warm pizza box, trying to shake the weird feeling in my gut. Maybe I was overthinking it. Maybe he was just awkward. An hour later, I had mostly forgotten about it. I was halfway through my pizza, curled up on the couch, when I heard it, a soft knock. Not the doorbell, just a knock. My stomach twisted. I wasn't expecting anyone. I crept to the door and looked through the peephole. It was him, the pizza guy. But he wasn't alone. 2 other men stood with him, both dressed casually. They weren't carrying anything, no pizza bag, no clipboard, just standing there. I froze, listening. Then I heard them whispering. "Is she home?" one of them asked. "I think so," the delivery guy whispered. "Saw her through the window." "All right, you sure she's alone?" the other voice asked. "Yeah," the pizza guy said. "Just make sure you knock twice, like last time." My breath caught in my throat. Like last time? I stumbled back from the door, my hands shaking. My phone was on the coffee table. I grabbed it and dialed 911, my voice barely above a whisper as I told the dispatcher what was happening. The operator's voice was calm. "Stay where you are, lock all doors and windows. Officers are on their way." I crept to the window, careful not to move the curtains. The 3 men were still there, whispering, shifting on their feet. Then I heard it. The door handle rattled. They were trying to get in. I clamped a hand over my mouth, heart hammering so loud I was sure they'd hear it. The dispatcher kept talking, keeping me calm, but all I could do was listen as the men outside whispered and rattled the handle again. Then, in the distance, sirens. The men stiffened, one of them cursed under his breath. "We gotta go!" Before I knew it, they were running down my driveway, disappearing into the night. Seconds later, flashing red and blue lights filled my street. The police found them 2 blocks away. They arrested all 3 on the spot. Turns out, the delivery guy had been casing homes in the neighborhood, looking for easy targets. The other 2 were his accomplices. They'd done this before, pretending to deliver food, checking to see who was alone, and then coming back later to rob the place, or worse. I don't know what would have happened if I hadn't called the cops in time, if they had forced their way in, if I had been slower to react. I still live in this house. It's a safe neighborhood, but I don't feel as safe as I used to. I have a security system now, cameras, deadbolts, and I never, ever tell a stranger I'm home alone. That night, my instinct saved me, and if you ever feel that same uneasy feeling, the one that makes the hair on the back of your neck stand up, trust it, because sometimes it's the only warning you'll get. After what happened to Natalie, I started thinking a lot about how we convince ourselves we're safe just because we live in quiet places. The truth is, it doesn't matter where you are. Danger doesn't need a city full of people. It only needs one moment of weakness. And sometimes, it doesn't come crashing through the door. Sometimes, it just stands there, waiting, watching. I had just moved to North Carolina, renting a small, one-story house on the outskirts of town. It was a good place. Quiet, a little old but charming. The kind of house with big windows that let in plenty of light during the day and turned into black mirrors at night. The first time I noticed the smudges on the glass, I didn't think much of it. Just some dirt maybe, or residue from the rain. But every morning they were there again, always in the same spot, right at the lower half of the living room window. It was on a Saturday night that I first saw him. I was sitting on the couch watching TV when I got that feeling, you know the one, like you're not alone, like someone is standing just behind you, staring. I turned my head toward the window and my stomach dropped. There was a figure outside, a man. He was standing just beyond the porch light, his face hidden in the shadows, but I could see his outline, tall, unmoving. I froze, my breath caught in my throat. My mind raced through 100 possibilities. A neighbor? Someone lost? But deep down, I already knew the truth. I reached for my phone, my hands shaking, but before I could call anyone, he stepped back into the darkness. I didn't sleep much that night. The next morning, I checked the window again. The smudges were back. This time, they weren't just vague marks. They were clearer. An imprint of a face. Nose. Lips. A smudge where a hand had pressed against the glass. Someone had been standing there, watching me. I told myself it was a coincidence. Maybe it was just a trick of the light, but the feeling stayed with me. I started checking the locks more often, making sure the curtains were closed tight before it got dark. A few nights later, I saw him again. This time, he was closer. It was past midnight, and I had gotten up to get some water. As I walked through the hallway, something outside caught my eye. The porch light flickered, casting strange shadows across the yard. And there, pressed up against the window, was a face. I barely stopped myself from screaming. I stumbled back, grabbing my phone, my pulse pounding in my ears. The face was still there, staring through the glass. I couldn't make out the details, just the outline, but I knew he was looking directly at me, and then he smiled. That was when I saw the glint of something in his hand. A knife. I bolted to my bedroom, locked the door, and called 911. My voice was shaking as I told the dispatcher what was happening. They told me to stay inside, keep quiet, and wait for officers to arrive. I could hear movement outside, footsteps on the porch. The slow, deliberate sound of a hand dragging across the window. My heart felt like it would burst out of my chest. Minutes later, flashing blue and red lights filled my yard. I heard shouting, the sound of officers moving around the house. But by the time they checked outside, the man was gone. They found footprints near the windows. Dirt smeared on the glass where he had been standing. But the worst part? When they checked the security footage from a neighbor's house, they discovered he had been coming back every night for a week. Just standing there, watching. When they caught him 2 nights later, he had a camera full of pictures. Of me. Pictures taken through my windows while I slept, while I watched TV, while I sat on the couch, completely unaware. I don't know what would have happened if I hadn't called when I did. I don't want to know. But now, every night before bed, I check the windows one last time. And sometimes, when I look out into the darkness, I wonder, who else is out there, watching from the shadows, waiting for the moment I forget to close the blinds? After Rachel's story, I started thinking about how much we take routine for granted. We tell ourselves that familiarity equals safety, that if we do something enough times, nothing bad will happen. But what if someone is watching? What if someone is waiting, studying your every move? You wouldn't notice, would you? Not until it's too late. I had always been a morning runner. It started back in law school, a way to clear my mind before the stress of the day hit. When I moved to Phoenix, it was no different. My new neighborhood was quiet, the kind of place where the biggest disturbance was a barking dog or a sprinkler turning on too early. The streets were lined with well-manicured lawns, families getting ready for their day, and the occasional jogger like me. I felt safe. The first time I got the feeling, I was halfway through my usual route. It wasn't anything obvious, just a prickling sensation at the back of my neck. I told myself it was nothing, just the quiet morning air messing with my head, but then it happened again. A few days later, as I rounded the corner onto an empty street, I swore I heard footsteps behind me. When I turned, no one was there. At first, I shrugged it off. Maybe I was being paranoid. Maybe it was an echo, or some trick of sound bouncing off the pavement. But then, one morning, I finally saw him. It was just past 5 a.m. The sky was still a deep blue, the streetlights flickering as the sun threatened to rise. I was running my usual route when I caught movement from the corner of my eye. Across the street, half wriggled behind a tree, stood a man. He wasn't running, wasn't walking, just standing there, watching. A jolt of fear ran through me. But I told myself it was nothing. Maybe he was just another early riser, waiting for a ride. I forced myself to keep going, but as I turned onto the next block, I glanced back. He was gone. The next few days, I convinced myself it had been a coincidence. But then, one morning, as I neared the end of my run, I saw him again. This time he was closer, standing on the sidewalk just ahead of me, like he was waiting. My pulse kicked into high gear. I didn't stop running. I didn't even let my pace slow. But my mind was racing. He wasn't dressed like a runner. No athletic gear, no earbuds, nothing that made sense for someone out at this hour. He wore all black, a hood pulled up just enough to cast a shadow over his face. I veered onto a different street, my breath coming faster now. When I glanced over my shoulder, he was following, not running, just walking, keeping pace, like he was waiting for me to do something. My stomach twisted into knots. I wasn't imagining this. He was real, and he was watching me. That's when I made a decision. I spotted a group of people a few blocks ahead, dog walkers, early commuters heading to their cars. I sprinted toward them, my heart pounding. When I reached the crowd, I turned back. The man was gone. That should have been the end of it. I told myself he was just some creep, that I wouldn't see him again, but I was wrong. A few nights later, as I was locking up my house, I noticed something outside my window, a shape in the dark, just standing on the sidewalk across the street. My blood ran cold. It was him. He had found where I lived. I shut off the lights, heart hammering in my chest. I peeked through the blinds, hoping, praying that he would leave. But he didn't. He just stood there, staring at my house. Then, after what felt like an eternity, he turned and walked away. That night, I barely slept. Every creak, every shift in the house made my nerves jump. The next morning, I called the police. They told me there wasn't much they could do, unless he had threatened me or tried to break in. I stopped running alone after that. I changed my schedule, ran with a group. But the fear never quite left me. I kept checking over my shoulder, watching the shadows, wondering if he was still out there, waiting for the day I let my guard down. A week later, they arrested him. Turns out, I wasn't his first target. He had been stalking women for months, following them, learning their routines. The police found notebooks filled with details, times, routes, addresses. My name was in there. The thought still makes me sick. If I hadn't trusted my instincts, if I had ignored that feeling for just one more day, I don't know what would have happened. So if you ever feel that prickle at the back of your neck, that inexplicable sense that someone is watching, don't ignore it. Change your route, switch up your routine. Because sometimes the scariest monsters aren't hiding in the dark. Sometimes they're walking right behind you. After Megan's experience, I couldn't stop thinking about how danger sometimes doesn't reveal itself immediately. Sometimes it watches, sometimes it waits, and sometimes it tests the boundaries, seeing just how far it can go before you realize it's already inside. When I moved to Montana, I was looking for peace. My work as an architect had been demanding, and I wanted solitude. Somewhere I could focus, breathe, think. The house I found was perfect. 2 stories, a big backyard, and best of all, it was tucked away on a quiet street, far from the noise of the city. It felt safe. That feeling didn't last. The first time I noticed the scratches on the door, I didn't think much of them. They were faint, just a few small marks near the bottom of the frame. I figured it was an animal, maybe a stray dog or a raccoon trying to get inside. I cleaned them off and forgot about it. A few days later they were back. More of them this time, and deeper, like something or someone had been dragging something sharp across the wood. I ran my fingers over the marks, unease creeping into my gut. It didn't look random, it looked deliberate. But I pushed the thought aside. This was Montana. I lived alone. No one had any reason to be at my house in the middle of the night. Then, I woke up at 2 a.m. to the sound of something moving outside. It was subtle, just a faint creaking, like someone shifting their weight on the porch. My heart pounded as I reached for my phone. I stayed completely still, listening. A minute passed, then another. Then, the sound of my door handle rattling. I sat up so fast I nearly knocked over my lamp. Someone was outside. Someone was trying to get in. I forced myself to breathe. The door was locked. The windows were shut. I wasn't in immediate danger. At least that's what I told myself. But the sound of the handle twisting, the subtle clicking of someone testing the lock, sent ice through my veins. I grabbed the nearest object, a heavy book from my nightstand, and moved slowly toward the door, careful not to make a sound. My hands trembled as I peeked through the peephole. A figure stood in the dark, tall, motionless, their face hidden beneath the hood of a jacket. My breath caught. I gripped my phone so tightly my fingers ached. I was dialing 911 before I even realized it, whispering to the operator, my voice barely audible. "I think someone is trying to break in." The dispatcher kept me calm, told me officers were on their way. I stayed there, pressed against the door, listening as the figure lingered for what felt like an eternity. Then, footsteps. Slow, deliberate, moving toward the side of the house. A new fear gripped me. What if there was another way in? What if the door wasn't the only thing they had tested? I crept through the house, my pulse hammering in my ears. I checked the back door, the windows, anything that could be an entry point. Everything was locked, but the knowledge that someone had been circling my house, looking for a way in, made my skin crawl. Then I heard the sirens. The flashing red and blue lights cut through the night, and for the first time I felt like I could breathe. The officers found fresh footprints in the dirt, leading from my front door to the back of the house. They searched the area, but didn't find anyone. But what they did find, what they showed me, made my stomach drop. The scratches on my door weren't just scratches. They were marks left by tools, a crowbar, a knife, something meant to pry open the lock. This wasn't random. Someone had been trying to get inside, and they had been trying for a while. The police stayed for a while, taking my statement, reassuring me they would patrol the area. But the truth was, I didn't feel safe anymore. That night, I barely slept. Every sound made me flinch. Every shadow felt like it was hiding something. The scratches on the door weren't just damage. They were a message, a warning, a reminder that someone had been here, waiting, watching, and they weren't done yet. The next morning, I installed security cameras. I reinforced the locks. I did everything I could to make sure no one could get inside, but no matter how much I tried to convince myself that I was safe, I couldn't shake the feeling that I had already let them get too close. Because danger doesn't always announce itself with a crash or a scream. Sometimes, it starts with something small, something you ignore, like a few scratches on the door. After Daniel's experience, I started thinking about how danger doesn't always announce itself with force. Sometimes, it hides in the shadows. Sometimes, it waits inside the places you think are safe. And sometimes, it watches you long before you even know it's there. When I moved to Chicago, I was excited. A new job, a new apartment, a fresh start. The place wasn't big, just a one-bedroom in an old brick building on the north side of the city. It had character. Wood floors, tall windows, a creaky front door. A little outdated, sure, but cozy. Safe. Or at least that's what I told myself. It started with small things. At first, I thought I was just being forgetful. A cabinet left open that I swore I had closed. A light left on when I was sure I had turned it off. But the strangest thing was the closet door. I always kept it shut. I hated the feeling of it being open at night, staring into the darkness. But every morning I'd wake up and find it slightly ajar. Just a crack, just enough to make my stomach turn. I told myself it was nothing. Old buildings settle, doors shift. Maybe I hadn't closed it all the way. But deep down, something felt off. Then came the noises. At night, just as I was drifting off to sleep, I'd hear it. A faint creak, like wood shifting under weight. Sometimes it came from the closet. Other times from the ceiling. The first time it happened, I sat up in bed, heart hammering. I listened for a while, but the noise stopped. I convinced myself it was the pipes, the wind, anything but what my gut was screaming at me. But it kept happening, and then, one night, I heard breathing. I woke up to the sound of soft, shallow breaths, just on the edge of hearing. My eyes flew open, my body frozen. I held my breath, listening. The room was dark, the air still, but the sound was there, coming from the closet. I grabbed my phone and turned on the flashlight, shining it toward the door. Nothing, just an empty space. The door was shut, but the feeling of being watched was so strong it made my skin crawl. I didn't sleep that night. The next day I did something I had never done before. I set up my phone to record while I slept. It felt ridiculous, but I needed to prove to myself that it was all in my head. The next morning I checked the footage, and my blood ran cold. Sometime around 3 a.m., the closet door slowly creaked open. Inch by inch, the camera caught it clearly. The darkness inside yawning wider, like a mouth opening. And then, something moved. A shadowy figure stepped out. I dropped my phone, my breath coming in short gasps. My mind refused to process what I was seeing. Someone had been in my closet. Someone had stepped out, stood there. And then, just before dawn, slipped back inside. I called the police, my hands shaking so badly I could barely hold the phone. I couldn't stay there. I grabbed my keys and ran outside, waiting for them to arrive. When they did, they searched the apartment. At first, they found nothing, but then they checked the air vents. Behind the closet wall, they found a crawl space. And inside they found blankets, food wrappers, a phone, a knife, and duct tape. Someone had been living in my apartment, watching me, waiting. I don't know how long they had been there, maybe weeks, maybe months. But the thought of them crawling out while I slept, standing in my room, breathing just feet away from me. I haven't been able to sleep in a dark room since. The police never found him. He must have slipped out before they arrived, but they told me something I'll never forget. He wasn't just squatting, he was planning something. That was the last night I ever spent in that apartment. And now, every night before I sleep, I check my closets. I check the vents. I check every dark corner of my home. Because sometimes, the real horror isn't what's outside your door. Sometimes, it's already inside. After Haley's nightmare, you'd think I'd be able to sleep a little easier. After all, I wasn't living alone. I had my husband Mark and our newborn daughter Lily. We had just moved into our dream home in Denver, a cozy 2-store house in a quiet neighborhood. It had a backyard, a nursery with soft yellow walls, and the kind of stillness at night that made it feel like we were the only people in the world. But now, after everything, I know that silence isn't always comforting. Sometimes it hides things. It started with the baby monitor. We had one of those high-tech ones with a camera and night vision hooked up to an app on our phones. I liked the peace of mind it gave me, letting me check on Lily without having to get out of bed. But then one night, I heard something strange. It was static at first, soft and intermittent, like white noise. I thought nothing of it, baby monitors pick up interference all the time. But then, as I rolled over in bed, something made my skin crawl. Beneath the static, I heard breathing, slow, deliberate breathing. I sat up instantly, my heart pounding. I reached for my phone and pulled up the app. The camera showed Lily, fast asleep in her crib, the soft rise and fall of her tiny chest. Nothing else. The nursery was empty. The breathing must have been a glitch, I told myself. It had to be. The next night, it happened again. But this time, I heard a voice. A low whisper crackled through the monitor. At first, I couldn't make out the words, but then, just as I turned my head toward the screen, I heard it clearly. I see you. I nearly dropped my phone. I bolted out of bed and ran to the nursery, throwing the door open so hard it hit the wall. Lily was still asleep. The room was empty. The baby monitor camera sat in its usual spot, its little green light blinking steadily. I told Mark about it the next morning. He laughed it off, saying it was probably a neighbor's signal interfering with ours. But I wasn't so sure. The voice sounded too close, too real. The third night was worse. I was in bed, my phone on the nightstand when I heard it again, but this time it wasn't just a whisper, it was movement. The sound of something shifting, a creak, the soft rustle of fabric, and then the voice again, but it wasn't coming from the monitor, it was coming from inside the house. I grabbed my phone and pulled up the app. The nursery camera feed flickered, then went black. My blood turned to ice. I shook Mark awake, whispering frantically, "Something's wrong. The camera's out. Someone's in the house." Mark jumped out of bed as I grabbed the nearest thing I could find, a heavy lamp from the nightstand. We moved toward the nursery, my hands shaking so badly I could barely hold onto my phone. As we reached the door, we heard a quiet scuffling sound, a soft exhale. Mark threw the door open. The room was empty. The crib was untouched. Lily still slept peacefully. But then, my eyes moved to the far wall. The vent cover was slightly ajar. Mark noticed it too. Without thinking, he moved toward it, gripping the edge of the cover and pulling. The vent came loose, and behind it, in the narrow darkness of a crawl space, we saw something we will never forget. A pile of blankets, a half-eaten sandwich, a small flashlight, and next to it, a phone. A phone that had been used to watch us, to whisper through the monitor, to let us know that even when we thought we were alone, we were never truly alone. We backed out of the room, locking the door behind us as we called 911. The police arrived within minutes. They searched the crawl space, the attic, every inch of the house, but whoever had been there was gone. They told us someone had been living in our walls, watching us, listening, and worst of all, they had been in the house long before we ever moved in. I don't know who they were, I don't know what they wanted, and I don't think I ever will. We moved out the next day, and now, I can't sleep without checking every room, every vent, every shadow, because sometimes, the monster isn't under the bed. Sometimes, it's already inside the house. If there's one thing I've learned from these stories, it's that danger rarely announces itself. It creeps in silently, disguising itself as a friendly face, a harmless routine, or an innocent noise in the middle of the night. Each of these encounters serves as a chilling reminder that we are often closer to danger than we realize. Natalie trusted her instincts when the delivery driver acted strangely, and that decision may have saved her life. Too often, we second-guess ourselves, convincing ourselves that we're just being paranoid. But the truth is, if something feels off, it probably is. Trust your gut. It's better to be overly cautious than to become a victim. Rachel's story warns us that sometimes we don't see the danger until it's too late. She noticed the smudges, the signs that someone was watching, but she brushed it off. Until the night she saw the man with the knife. If you feel like you're being watched, take it seriously. Lock your doors. Install security cameras. Never assume it's nothing, Megans. Experience with the jogging stalker highlights a terrifying reality. Predators look for patterns. The moment you establish a routine, someone with bad intentions can use it against you. If you run, walk home from work, or do anything at the same time every day, switch it up. Carry self-presence tools, and always be aware of your surroundings. Daniel's encounter in his own home shows how easy it is to ignore small signs of danger until they escalate. The scratches on his door weren't just wear and tear, they were warnings. Too often we assume our homes are safe, but that security is an illusion. Always check your locks, pay attention to the small signs, and never assume that just because nothing has happened yet, nothing will. Haley's story is the nightmare that so many of us dismiss, the idea that someone could already be inside. The noises, the misplaced objects, those were all red flags. But it wasn't until she saw the closet door move that she truly understood what was happening. If something in your home doesn't feel right, investigate it. It could be nothing, but it could also be something far worse. And finally, Emily's discovery reminds us that even the walls around us don't always keep the monsters out. Sometimes they're living inside them. If your baby monitor picks up strange sounds, if your security camera flickers at the wrong moment, don't ignore it. It might not just be a glitch. E-stories aren't just horror, they're cautionary tales. They remind us that danger doesn't always come in the form of a masked figure lurking in the dark. Sometimes it's the person standing at your door, the stranger who knows your schedule, or the sound of breathing through a speaker that should be silent. To everyone who has listened, shared, and engaged with these stories, thank you. Enigma of the Unknown exists because of you. Stay safe, stay aware, and most importantly, trust your instincts, because sometimes the only thing standing between you and the unthinkable is a single decision. Until next time, keep your doors locked, your eyes open, and your instincts sharp.